I had a diagnosis of cancer, but only because I went out of my way to get screened and tested, get a whole body MRI and a bunch of tests done that aren't in the standard recommendations for how you would be pre-screened.
Bringing you a reasoned approach to health and fitness. This is the Phi Life Podcast.
Welcome to the Phi Life Podcast. I'm John Barbin. With me is Brad Pilon. And today we're going to talk about the difference between population health and individual health. And we're trying to help you think your way through like where you fit in on that and why there even is such a thing as the difference between population and individual health. And I guess I can start with my example, which is going to be an easy way to lead us through how to really think about how this might affect you. So I had a diagnosis of cancer, but only because I went out of my way to get screened and tested, get a whole body MRI and a bunch of tests done that aren't in the standard recommendations for how you would be pre-screened.
And you weren't looking for cancer, you were just curious what this testing looked like, right? There's nothing wrong with you. It led you to be like, I'm going to go get tested to make sure something's not happening. You were just like, oh, this test seems cool.
I mean, it was a preventative thing, but not at all because I had a symptom. I didn't, it's not like I was coughing or anything. And I'm like, gee, I wonder if there's
inkling of cancer, right? Like it's,
no. Well, in fact, the scan that picked the tumor up that was in my lung was actually a scan for your chest, more focused on your heart.
Right.
So, and when I asked my physician, oh, what's going on? Like, how did we end up with something about my lung on a heart scan? He said, oh, well, it's that particular CT scan is just doing this whole area. So it's going to pick up all kinds of incidental stuff around your heart. And that's when we found the tumor. So this particular scan that I did, as Brad said, I was no symptoms. I just went out of my way. I paid out of pocket, right? The system doesn't even have this scan built in. And then I find a tumor. So then when I talked to my physician about this, I'm like, well, at first it's a mass that we don't know what it is. All we know is it's there.
Yeah.
And then the next step was just wait and see if it grows, which I was like, oh, I don't like the way that sounds either.
That's horrible.
I know, right? Like,
yeah.
Well, and I said, okay, so talk me through this, right? So I'm just learning a lot. And he was very calm and casual when he saw the scan. He's like, we found this little thing here, but the radiologist has to like document it. They're not going to just say, well, we were looking at his heart, so we're just not going to talk about anything else we found. They document everything. So they found this, this at the time it was under a certain size, they call it a nodule versus a tumor. So given its dimensions, they call it a nodule. It's worth paying attention to. But given its size, it's 95% chance benign. So here we go with the statistics. Here we go with population versus individual.
So based on the data we have from studying large populations of people, there's a 95% chance your nodule is benign.
Benign. In the absence of symptoms, which I had no symptoms, and given its dimensions on the scan, it's a very, very high likelihood in the 95% range. Again, based on some epidemiological data that we have. It's not like they just scan a bunch of people and come up with this number. That it's likely benign. And I was like, okay. He's like, at this point, it could even be a bolus of mucus, like that can appear on the scan.
It's a piece of gum you swallowed 7 years ago.
Yeah, right. So he's like, he's like, okay, you know what? Let's test this again in 3 months and see if it's changed in size. If it is just a bolus of mucus, it should clear by then, so it just won't be there.
Off topic, but how much those 3 months suck then? Just sitting there waiting to see if something grew or not.
Yeah, it's but he was so confident that it was benign and could even be a bolus of mucus. Even on the report, they're like, we can't rule out that this is just not a mucus mass that can clear. Because in your lungs, you can have that, right? You can have like a little mucus here and there. Yeah. And if you've ever seen an MRI of someone's head, you have like mucus boluses like in your sinuses that can just clear and be there and clear. So he was very like, you could tell he was functioning from a standpoint of both experience and understanding the probabilities that it's highly likely this is not a malignancy. It's highly likely even
P of less than 5%, right? Like
Yeah.
your standard,
Right,
your standard,
right.
that's definitely benign based on research kind of idea.
Sure. So and to his credit, he's not trying to get me like worried. He's just explaining what he's seeing, and he's seeing, and in his mind, he's already doing the calculation that, yeah, this is like, given its size, given how we found it, you don't have any symptoms. You're 47 years old. There's this, like, every arrow points to this thing being benign. If it's even an actual tissue mass versus being literally just mucus, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, all we know is the CT shows a mass. We have no idea what it is. Statistically, the odds are so against it being a malignancy.
Right.
So we just wait, and I'm like, okay, well, I'd like to rescan. I don't want to wait that long. He's like, okay, well, I mean, that's the whole reason I went to this place, spent the money, and did this preventative thing anyways. If we found something, I don't want to just ignore it. Like, I want to know more about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what am I doing here, right? So we go the 3 months, we rescan. It's still there. It's still the same size. So now,
okay.
So the answer, did I not tell you this part? Like this?
No,
like,
no.
Oh, okay.
New to me.
All right. Okay, so we go and rescan after 3 months. It's still the same size. Now, at this point, they rule out a bolus of mucus. It's not.
Because it would have cleared in 3 months.
It would have cleared in 3 months. It wouldn't be the identical size. Like, now we know it's a defined mass that isn't going anywhere. This is tissue growing, right? This is an actual tissue, not mucus floating around. So at this point, I'm like, okay, now what? And he's like, well, since it hasn't grown, it's likely not cancer, because cancer is especially high grade. So I don't know if people are aware of this, but there's high and low grade cancer. I mean, there's all different categories of all
high
different
and
kinds.
low grade cancer.
So the particular cancer I ended up having, which took a while to even figure it out. We'll talk about that later. You can have a high and low grade form, which is a fast growing or a slow growing.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
High grade, not good. Anyone listening who's unfortunately either knows someone or had this diagnosis, and you don't want to hear the words high grade. Like, that's rough to hear that.
Yeah.
So, and that means it can grow faster and has a much higher likelihood of metastasizing. Low grade grows very slow, very low likelihood of metastasizing, meaning spreading into other tissues, right?
Right.
So anyways, at this point, all we know is it's still a mass. We don't have nothing besides it's just not mucus. So I go to him. I'm like, well, what do we do now? And he's like, well, we just wait and test again. And if it's growing with any rate that we can measure over 6 months or, the next 3 months, that's telling us it's cancer. But just think about what he's saying to me right now. He's saying all we're going to do is wait and see how fast it grows. And if it's growing really fast, now we know it's cancer.
Yeah.
Jeez. Because nothing else in your body goes. First of all, that lump's not even supposed to be there, right? So that nodule is just normal human bronchial passages don't have lumps sticking out in them, right? So we already know it's an abnormal growth. Now we're just trying to figure out, is it benign or malignant? And the way we do is just wait around to see if it's growing super fast. And that now, after doing a lot of research, I realized that means it would have been high grade, meaning the bad one that spreads.
So they're waiting to see if it. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yep.
So the best way to figure out if it's a cancer, you just wait to see if it's growing really fast, which by definition means it's the one that spreads really fast. At the time, I didn't know that's like the calculus. All I knew was we're just going to wait.
Yeah.
And so this is where, as I really appreciate him as a physician, he sensed that I wasn't comfortable with that answer. And he actually called me back. He's like, you know what? You really didn't seem comfortable with the caution, like the waiting, the wait. And there's a specific term for it, but you just wait and see. And it's just, right?
Wait and see. That's the exact term.
But there's but you have it scheduled. You have it scheduled to have another look. But this is kind of the pattern, right? And again, at its size, statistically, it's highly, highly likely it's benign. And I don't like it. It really bothered me when it was there and it wasn't the mucus and it's same size, but I'm like, okay, and we're just going to wait. I didn't like the answer. So he calls me back. He's like, you really didn't like that answer. And I'm like, no, I didn't. He's like, you know what? Let's go get it. Let's get it biopsied for your peace of mind. And I'm like, okay, now you're sounding like what I want to do here. Like I want to, I didn't go all this way to just wait around to find out it's a fast
Measure,
growing
test,
cancer.
identify. That's what you wanted.
Yeah, let's test it. So at this point, I'm in the United States. I don't have health coverage here. I still have my Canadian health coverage, but like you're what, 3,500 miles away because it's across the country. It's all that stuff, right? So I go in to get quotes on biopsies. Now this is kind of funny. They don't even know how to quote somebody who's not using insurance. So I'm like, well, I like, don't you guys do this? And he's like, yeah, well, I don't even know how to quote you number. Like I was talking to one of the people on the phone, and she's like, oh, geez, I'll have to get back to you. So you don't have insurance. I'm like, no, what's it cost? And she's like, I don't even know who to ask.
You're like,
and
I'll
so
give you $7. Yes.
Well, so this is my first, and get this is my first experience at the American medical system. I'm trying to pay out of pocket for a biopsy, like not probably the best entry. Anyways, so they finally get back to me and they quote me, I think $70,000, but they can
biopsy.
For a biopsy, right? And they don't have to put you under. They go like down your throat, and now they freeze your throat and all of that, and it takes like 10 minutes, right?
Yeah.
She's like, but we can, all of these discounts and rebates and yada yada, we can do it for 18,000. I'm like, and this, I might have come across as rude. I'm like, are you hearing yourself right now? Like, are you listening? Like, do you just understand what you just said to me? You just said $70,000 for a biopsy, which is absurd, absolutely absurd. Yeah. Then you thought you were cutting me a deal at $18,000. Like, both numbers are ridiculous. And I can't believe you just said that with a straight face, or whatever your face must look like on the other end of the phone, because you weren't sounding like you were laughing there. Like you thought that was a serious deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
so
I have 18 grand kicking around. Yeah.
If that's what it takes, like, we're doomed. Like, we're utterly doomed. So, now to be fair, I didn't have insurance, so I don't know how this game works down here. Like, I've become familiar, but at the time, I have no idea. In Canada, you just hand your card over, but then they hand you back an answer like, yeah, we'll get to it in 3 years, right? So like both systems have their, whatever it is, it's a long time. So I just get all this dealt with back in Canada. So I'm on flights back and forth trying to figure out like how to get this done. So I go back to Canada, I get my normal GP, he gets all the results. He recommends a respirologist who I see. And then after seeing the respirologist, he's like, oh, I actually can't do this. I have to refer you to a pulmonologist who can finally do the biopsy. I was like, I came all this way just for you to tell me I have another appointment. So I fly back to California, then I fly back to Ontario, and I finally see my pulmonary surgeon who finally does the biopsy.
What's the timeline there? A couple weeks, couple months?
Takes like for 4 to 6 weeks between the first visit, the fly back, and the fly back out.
Right.
And when I finally get the referral to the pulmonary surgeon, who, by the way, is the surgeon, he's a fantastic surgeon who did my lobectomy. He was great. But then he wants all of the scans redone in Canada because he wants them in his system. And his because
they weren't metric.
Well, I guess he needs them. He needs them in the system tracked. So he's got like the paper trail. He's done his due diligence. Well, however, he's supposed to do this before he starts cutting people up. Right. So then I go back for like another MRI, another CT scan, a pulmonary breath test so I can actually like push air, just a bunch of tests that he's you could tell he's required to do this before he starts doing anything in there. Then we finally get the biopsy. So this is taking 6-7 weeks, and I'm flying back and forth to do this again because I just don't have insurance in the United States. Otherwise, I'm sure it could have all been done without some absurd price tag.
Yeah, right.
Finally get the biopsy results back, and that phone call, that's such a rattling phone. Anyone who's had this phone call knows how jarring that phone call is, right? So I was at a Panera Bread, and I was just sitting there, and I finally get the phone call, and he's like, and now I'm back in California, right? So it's been a couple of 2-3, I don't know how many days or weeks it is, but we have a scheduled call, and he's like, yeah, it's cancer. And then I kind of just like go white, when you like almost get hit by a car.
Yeah.
And then he's like, and then I'm like, my very first thing is like, could that diagnosis be wrong? And he's like, no, like we're pretty thorough. The lab like knows what they're doing. It's cancer. And I was like, oh, okay. So I don't know, what do I do? And the very first thing he said, and I guess this is because this is what everyone asks, he's like, you're not going to die. I'm like, okay, all right, so appreciate that. And I'm like, that's a bit of an odd thing to say, but in retrospect, I'm like, oh, he probably like, the very next thing people probably ask is like, how many years do I have? And then I'm like, okay, so what do we do? He's like, well, you're going to come back up here for some testing, and we're going to book a surgery. I was like, oh, all right, okay, let's do that. And so again, I'm going back and forth. I finally get the surgery booked, and we go in. And then when I get to like the operating room is when this entire experience switched to, it's weird, but that's the moment where it really felt that like it was about me, and it switched being like statistics. And
how well do you fit into the probabilities versus now you're the individual being treated?
Yeah, it progressed from, oh, this is probably what it is. We're just going to wait around and watch. Oh, this is like, we don't have to, could be mucus, whatever. We'll just kind of wait around. And I'm like, well, okay. Well, actually, no, when my physician was like, you didn't seem to like be comfortable with that answer. That was one of the first, right? Well, at least he recognized,
he humanized the situation a bit.
He humanized it back then. Only because he recognized me being uncomfortable with the standard like canned answer, right? And then he's like, he didn't like that answer. I'm like, no, of course.
I wonder how many people would be more comfortable with the wait around and see, like just hope it went away. Just like, I'm going to wait 3 months, they're going to redo the scan, and nothing will be there. That's what's going to, that as opposed to your approach was like, no, I want this measured, tested, I want to know, right? Like,
well, you know what's interesting? I told Dina about this, and some of her friends at work when they heard that I had the cancer, they're like, oh, I wouldn't want to know. And I thought that was
and that's
the oddest
huge
reaction.
discussion for another day. But yeah, the fear of knowing versus the fear of not knowing, I guess. Yeah, I think you kind of go one of two ways there.
Well, when she told them this, I think they all just assumed that like I'm going to die or something like that. And they're like, I just wouldn't want to know, because they don't want to have this like, I don't know. They don't want to have this moment of like, oh my God, this is my mortality or something.
Yeah, possibly. It's just scary. And I think different people deal with that different people deal with that differently, John. But yeah, I don't really know what to say, but I do know that generally you're in one of two frames of mind. You're the like, let's find out, or the let's ignore it and see if it goes away. Mm-hmm. There's really no in between there. Yeah.
And these are people that work in the medical profession. Like, oh, I don't want to know.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
But you know what though? Because they probably see the worst of it, being in the medical community, right? Working as a profession in that maybe that's why. Like, it's, in a hospital, you see the people who aren't recovering, I guess, as much as you know what I mean? Like they see the worst case. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's part of it. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that could be it too. The knowledge is just I guess when you just say that, it's stressful to hear. I mean, it was stressful for me to hear. And they're like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. Like, it's just something I don't want to think about. So just ignorance is bliss in this case, I guess.
Yeah.
But the progression from there is no standard test for lung cancer, by the way. Like, there is none. Even though it's the third leading cancer behind, I think it's breast and then colon.
Prostate. Oh, colon, yeah.
Breast, prostate, and colon, which we have, by the way, we have screening, right? They're recommended that you do.
But you don't screen your lungs, as far as I know.
Well, it's weird, though, because when you look at the chart, it's right up there. And I guess
it's independent of smoking, too. That's the part that blows my mind, right? It's really, really high in non-smokers as well. Whereas, from a grew up in the 90s guy, it was like, no, smoking causes lung cancer. That was the message we got. And that was, so if you had lung cancer, it's because you smoked.
Right. And so even though it's one of the highest incidents of cancer, we don't even tell people to screen. Yet I just went out of my way to screen, and I just found it. So I'm like, really, that's it? Like a CT scan? We just can't schedule that at, I don't know, 45 years old, just go and have a look or something?
Yeah.
The same way we do with colon cancer. They just recommend doing a colonoscopy. I
Teeth
think
cleaning and just checking for cavities, right? Like
well, I just and then a dermatologist can give you a once over and see if any little moles and things look like they might be cancerous.
Yeah.
It seems like it seems so simple. Like by the time I was done, I'm like, that was it. Like that's all it took to find this, and that's not standard. Especially, it's like in lung cancer is like one of the leading. I think it's the leading cause of death by cancer after.
yeah, you've got breast, lung and bronchus, prostate, and colorectal cancers are 50% of all new cancers in the U.S. And account for like 50% of all cancer deaths. Right. So breast cancer and colorectal are breast, lung, and colorectal 1, 2, 3. But we screen for breast cancer regularly. And screen for colon cancer.
Yes.
Just
we
not
just
lung. Just number 2. We just skipped the 1 and 3. We got covered, right? Like,
yeah, I don't understand. I don't understand that at all. Like it. So, anyways, obviously, I'm super biased, but why wouldn't you add that one in too? If all it was this, maybe I don't understand. There's another way to do it, but that if we caught it, we caught it. I don't understand why else. How much more complicated can it be? One CT scan.
yeah.
And anyways, so moving from.
But now, hold on. It wasn't
go ahead.
one CT scan because you got a Pronovo scan, which is different software than your. Like, I wonder if you got a traditional CT, would it have picked it up?
No. This was
a traditional. Okay.
Yes,
okay,
this
cool.
was traditional CT.
cool.
I know what you're talking about, but no, this is just traditional standard CT. Nothing fancy.
Wow, okay.
Every medical system in North America has it. It shouldn't.
Yeah.
It's not fancy or anything. But anyways, moving from the population level at the very, very beginning of this process of just you're in these statistics and we're just going to function off statistics and likely benign. Then, I kind of like, I don't like that, the way that feels, all the way to getting the biopsy and then actually getting the surgery. And once I was saying to this off air, once I was in the operating room, like walking in the operating room, that's where it really feels like it's about you. And that's like really now we're down to the art of medicine. Like we're down to the art of health. Just because like at this point, it's not like every procedure is the same. Like the surgeon is got to employ, he's got to think on his feet as it's happening. And this is
now
where
we're individual care. Person in front of you, you could open them up and you don't know what you're going to find, but you have to work with it, right? And you have a good idea based on populational data, but the amount of stories we've heard of, people going in to get their appendix removed and find out the appendix is on the other side or behind things it should have been in front of. Like, so it happens. And so that surgeon is kind of the artist who has to take the learnings from populational medicine and apply it to an individual.
100%.
Yeah.
Now, obviously the best in North America, at least the best technology that exists is in that room and the most highly trained people are in that room. So, but once he's going, this is the art of it all. And in my case, the tumor was in a really, really difficult spot to get to.
Right.
And so my pre-surgery sign-off was only to take the lower left lobe. But the tumor was so close to the junction of upper and lower lobe, he actually stopped in the middle. First of all, he had to pull in another surgeon. I went way longer than it should have taken. And he was like, we might have to take the whole left lung. And so he was like a minute or two away from asking my mom for that consent because she was like the other person that can consent.
Right.
And him and the other surgeon's like, nah, he's young. He can survive. He can survive another surgery if we have to go back in. Let's try to save the upper lobe.
Right.
And thank God they did. And the other thing is this tumor we had 2 millimeters of wiggle room to save the upper lobe. Like that's how close it was to losing the whole upper lobe.
Wow.
And this particular surgery, we go in with just like 3 little holes and like robot stuff. Whereas that you can do that on the lower, but you can't do that on the upper. If you have to do upper, it's like break your ribs, 6 or 7 inch scar, like wide, like this is an open, like you like bring the thing wide open, and it introduces all more complications with blood vessels and stuff that aren't part of the lower lobe. Afterwards, the physician's like, you don't want that one. Like
no, my dad had that one. That was the one where
there you go.
You've got drainage tool like tubes and crack open scar, looked like he was in a samurai sword fight. Yeah, right. So you don't want that one at all. No.
Right. And so they managed to get it all, which is great. But again, 2 millimeters away from losing the upper one. And that's the art. That was the art. Him and the other surgeon had to figure out what can we do how do we combine this guy's current risk? He's young enough that he probably wants to keep this upper lobe, but we can't be irresponsible and leave cancer in his body if we don't get enough tissue. So they're up against this decision. Does this kid wake up missing the whole left lung and we never signed off on that and put my mom on the spot to have to make that decision? So this is where the human thing comes in right here.
It's funny. You get online in usually just benign, wrong word, ridiculous arguments about nutrition, right? And someone will drop the whole, well, data doesn't care about your feelings. And I hate that line so much because but your interpretation of the data does, right? And that's the whole art of it, right? Is so that surgeon and his team, or his guy, had to interpret the data of population-based data very quickly to figure out what was in your best interest or your feelings, right? So the data might not care about your feelings, but 100% my or your interpretation of the data does. And that drives me nuts when people say that, because I'm like, the fact you're saying that line so smugly on a Twitter argument just proves that your feelings definitely care about your interpretation of that data. Otherwise, you wouldn't throw that line out. But in this point, is the quick interpretation of the available data in the given situation with the given patient right in front of you, like that is the art. That's what the underrated surgeon and his or her decades of experience, that's what we want, right? We don't want a binder full of research papers on a population performing surgery on you. That's not what you want, right? You want someone with that knowledge, but then is applying it in a way that is in one person's best interest, and that person is you.
Right. And I get that he had a tough decision, and my mom probably would have barfed when she was asked that question.
Yeah, I'm glad I wasn't there.
Like why? The last thing she wants to be doing is put on the spot, and then, oh, honey, by the way, I told them just take your whole left lung. And I'm like, wait, I didn't sign off on that. So to their credit, they're like, we don't want to put her on the spot. We're trying to save this guy's upper lobe because he's otherwise healthy, and he's probably going to really appreciate having two-thirds of his lungs versus half, right? Yeah. Or sorry, what am I saying? 3/4 of his lungs versus half. So again, and to Brad's point, they took into account how I would feel about it, not what the data says. Yeah. And that was, and I super appreciate it now. And it was close. And in the end, he's like, you know what? If we have to, I'm sure he'll appreciate we did this, and that he could come back again if we have to. So it's not, it's not like, well, that's it. If there's cancer in there, we're leaving it, and it's just going to grow forever. Like there was a way to get back to it. So, and that's when I realized like how different the two ways I was, the ways I was interacting with the medical system was so cold and statistical, and I'm just part of a stat at the beginning, and at the end, like this is serious. Like they're in the middle of cutting me up, and he's like, how is he going to feel about this? Yeah. And it would be super nice if it was that the whole way through.
And what's interesting is that entire way through, because 95% chance it was benign, and it wasn't, that entire way through you were, but absolutely were not a statistic, right? That was the problem. You were an outlier. You were an individual. Right. And we were trying to apply populational data to you, which is like, yeah, dude, 95% chance is nothing. Let's wait around. Right. So, and then, so that is the crux of individual versus populational health, not just medicine, is that there are outliers and I would argue that in the hundreds of thousands of different ways we exist, you're going to be an outlier in some way, whether it's some sort of hereditary disease or risk of a disease or your height or your weight or just somewhere in there, you're going to be a slight outlier, and it may or may not be a life-saving issue or a life opposite of that in your lifetime. Could be a completely useless area to be an outlier in, or it could be something that was really, really important. But populational data, you just assume that's not the case.
If I'd have left the entire process in the hands of the medical system, given its sort of functioning off of population health, I guess, at the beginning of the process. There was no screening for this. I would have never got screened for it. It would currently be growing. And as our, I only had 2 more millimeters of size before I would have lost the whole left lobe if we ever found it. So I could pretty confidently say, left with the way the system functions, I was for sure headed for losing the whole left lung at minimum.
Right.
Whenever it finally revealed itself.
Yeah. So my dad's cancer was Ewing sarcoma. And Ewing sarcoma typically only affects children, like 2 or 3 years and under. And it usually starts in the long bone in the legs, right? So the mortality rate is extremely, extremely high, because when your kid comes up and is like, my leg kind of hurts, as a 2-year-old, you're like, because you banged it, you moron. Like, it's not, you don't think, oh, maybe that's a tumor growing on the long bones of your leg. And so the mortality rate, exceptionally high. And generally, because of that, we don't have a lot of information on that specific cancer. So my dad ends up with Ewing sarcoma. And this is kind of almost an example of how, populational data can help, right? Because my dad being in his 70s when he was diagnosed, they were able to then research Ewing sarcoma in an adult. And we actually have a friend who does this for her. Was it grad work, or is she a professional outside of school who studies Ewing sarcoma specifically?
Oh, I can't remember.
Yeah. So anyway, we have friends who are studying it. And so my dad had a long fight with Ewing sarcoma because he's a stubborn ass and just wasn't going to stop living because of a cancer. So he pushed that as long as he could. And then I find it interesting because 4 years ago, a hockey player on the Philadelphia Flyers, Oscar Lindblom, got diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma. And he's survived and is still playing. So I kind of like the fact that kind of worked together. But that is an example of the data being fed into sort of populational data or whatever, being used to improve the diagnosis and treatment on an individual level. So they work together. But the main thing is remembering that populational data is exactly that. Because research is only as good as the question it's trying to answer and how that question is worded and formed, right? Mm-hmm. So what people forget is populational research is answering questions on a populational level. It's not meant to deal with John Barbin specifically. It's meant to deal with large populations as maybe a diagnostic and a screening tool, etc. But at some point, you have to jump from populational medicine or health to individual. And it's that jump off point and that realization that we are no longer asking questions that are answered by populational data. We now need individual data. And I think in most, let's move away from medicine, but most health and fitness, the mistake we make as really, even with both of us having graduate degrees, amateur reviewers of research, right? Mm-hmm. And then not just you and me, but literally everyone on the internet, et cetera, is really taking the time to recognize what question is this paper or group of papers or review trying to answer, and how does that actually relate to what I'm interested in looking for. And with populational research, it's, you're constantly forgetting it's based on large populations. So a fantastic example, the one that gets used all the time, is the BMI. BMI, or body mass index, which is a measure of your weight versus your height. So your weight cubed or your height cubed. It comes up with a number between, I don't know, with the lower levels are 16, and man, we've blown past the upper limits into the 40s, etc. But it's a way of taking a large population, doing a very easy measurement of, okay, how tall are you? What's your weight? Next. How tall are you? What's your weight? Next. And you end up with BMI being an incredibly useful way to say, hey, when you look at that population of 100,000 people, their BMI is much higher than this population of 100,000 people. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it's more than likely that first 100,000 is carrying excess body fat because they're not 100,000 bodybuilders living in a country together. But When you take the BMI down to an individual level, and I go, hey, John, based on your BMI, you're obese. And you're like, dude, I'm like 2 weeks away from being beach ready right now, right? Abs are out. I look great. What are you talking about? I'm like, I'm talking about based on this number right here, you are obese. You need to do something about it. And then the correct answer there is like, are you using a populational tool to decide what's exactly right for me? And I would go, oh, shoot. Yeah, you're right. Sorry, my mistake. I should probably be looking at something more individual based for you. Like, I'm going to take your height, your waist, your shoulders, and maybe ask you a couple individual questions like, hey, John, do you work out a lot? And you're like, yeah, all the time. I'm like, oh, that could account for the excess weight I'm looking at, right? But so BMI is a beautiful example of something that is useful looking at large populations, but not useful on an individual level without the art of actually looking at the person and being like, wait, now that we're on a Zoom call, I see what's going on, right? Like, and vice versa, you can't then take individual results, which is like, man, BMI was totally off for John, and realize and think, therefore, the BMI is a useless tool for populations, right? It's two different levels of research, and it's two different questions being answered. And I think that's the main difference between the populational viewpoint and the individual is the individual research, individual questions being answered takes into account the individual. That's the art of it, is looking at, the person in front of you and being like, he's not going to want that upper lobe removed, or there's so much going on. It has to deal with the one person in front of you and not taking just populational data and being like, I don't care what you say. This tool used for populations, this BMI says you're obese, therefore you're obese and you have to lose weight, right? That would be ridiculous, but that's what happens occasionally.
Mm-hmm. And the BMI is a good one. It's a good one, and it's illustrative in both directions. It shows that if you strength train with an eye to gaining as much muscle mass as possible, you can show up in the overweight category, potentially even in the obese category, if you just build a lot of muscle.
Yeah.
But so then it doesn't work for someone who does that. But the other side of it is for people who just have never lifted a weight and are never gonna lift a weight. It's actually not a bad starting point. And yeah. I think that's who it was built on in the first place.
Well, if you take 100,000 random people, like we talked about in other podcasts, how many, 200 of them might work out consistently?
Not very many.
Right. So then it's a valid tool in a population based thing. But if you're deciding that you're doing grad work on the BMI and you happen to have access to the NFL, you could erroneously state that the NFL is a league full of obese men playing sports.
Yeah, and then yes, exactly. So it's a crude measurement again, which is useful for and it gives doctors a starting point. Like, you got to start somewhere. I mean, you got to start somewhere when you're assessing somebody. It's like, okay, well, I don't know, where's their BMI? Do they even work out? Do we have a reason why their BMI is where it's at? It could be genetic, it could be lifestyle, it could be a bit of both. They could be forcing it up by lifting weights to try to build bigger muscles. Like, there's all different reasons why you just even land on that one simple measurement. There's a lot of things that go into where you even land on that scale.
And
have you been there long?
Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Populational data is what you use to refute individual results. So someone loses weight on a diet, and you review the latest meta-analysis of 3,000 people who've used that diet, and they didn't lose weight. So you look at that person and be like, you didn't lose weight in that diet. And the person's like, I totally, just 12 weeks of it, I did. And you're like, no, you didn't. 3,000 people already didn't, so you didn't too. And so that becomes and then you get in the argument of, I know you were doing the carnivore bunny diet, but you didn't really, it was just calorie restriction. You start moving goalposts, and the guy's like, whatever. I followed that guru. He told me to only eat bunny, I don't know, and then I lost weight. So, but it becomes a way to refute what you're seeing with your own eyes. And I find that dangerous, because you're forgetting the absolute importance of the question attempting to being answered by that research. Right. And so you can never take it to that level, but we try to consistently. Right. And in fact, we've had conversations with people who do research where the population, the size of the group that you're studying could become large enough that something that was significant can no longer be significant, right? Like it can jump around. So the population being studied in population research has to fit you. As an example, a populational study of 300,000 postmenopausal women, the results may not apply to you, right? So, or vice versa, the research done on, nothing but 20-year-old university-aged male students might not apply to a postmenopausal woman, right? So you just really have to be careful with what was the question that we were trying to answer with that study, and then how are you trying to interpret that into your own personal needs and biases.
That's a really good example. So Brad and I have been the subject in many of our friends' graduate work, PhD work. We got recruited into a lot of trials where we were the subjects in exercise studies, lifting studies, testing biomechanics, testing muscle activity, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Tyson, those sucked, by the way.
Yeah. Well, and anyway, but the point is, like, that data is derived on a group of guys who worked out regularly. And so so even the same group of guys, if you measured them today, whatever, like 25 years later, we're not going to get the same results.
No, you're not. Yeah.
So that's an example of data that's published, and it's collected correctly. Everything's done correctly, but even the people in that study, it doesn't represent them a number of years later of those exact same people. So that's how specific data actually gets. In that case, it would be a neat thing to get all the exact same people and test them again, and then you could publish another study saying in that group of people, this is what happens 30 years. Right. But anyways, that's how specific the data that anyone's talking about, that's how specific it can really get. It's in that group of people at that age at that time.
Remember the one we were trying to do maximal ab contractions, and it was like my ab actually folded under my rib. Oh, it was horrible. Not fun.
Yeah, it could get all stuck. It's almost like a spasm, right?
Yeah. So the point we're trying to make here is that the most fundamental part of research is the question being asked, and for the large part, when you're worried about the health of a group of people or a nation, right? You want you want your questions to specifically address a population, right? But when it comes down to individual care, those questions can be a guiding light, right? And they can lead you down the right path. But in the end, you need that individual data. And oftentimes, you're right back down to the experiences and skill of the artist, which is the surgeon or the person doing work on you, to really make sure that you make it through, right? It's paramount that you at some point make that flip from populational to individual. Yeah.
And it extends to anything to do with diet recommendations. It extends to how you choose to work out. Like any one given workout protocol is not going to be the same or have the same efficacy for any one person compared to the next person over it. Go ahead.
Do you know what kills me?
What's that?
You see it all the time online is the metric. So it's like, to be a strong person, you should be able to bench press 1.7 times your weight, and you should be able to deadlift 2 and front squat 2.5. And you're like, really? Like, it's so I've had repeated leg injuries and I need to have a 2.5, or I don't care at all. It's just such a weird way to try to make, again, someone fit in the populational data. And we do this to an extent with our Adonis and Venus numbers, right? We did say, based on the data we have from the art of sculpture and the art of drawing superheroes, etc., combined with the data we have from NASA and Division I athletes, to look aesthetically like a strong person, you would want roughly these numbers. And it works, but 95% of the time. And then there's those 5% outliers who are like, I can never hit that number. Or like there's that one guy we dealt with, he's like, I literally have to cut off a shoulder to get down to your numbers. And the Adonis shoulders are massive, but he just was very, Ben Affleck in the cross the shoulders. So there is that 5%. And you have two choices at the time. It's like, that guy's lying. Or, oh, you're an outlier and we'll work with you, the tech looking at that could have been like, it says cancer, but it really probably isn't. So I'm just going to say it's not, and you wouldn't be here right now, right? So it's when you make that flip and realize that person is an individual, an outlier. The data is what it is, and we're going to roll with it.
So when it comes to diet, just because there's standard recommendations doesn't mean they apply to you directly. This is trial and error. You got to see how any particular thing you do, if you do anything, right? If you aren't concerned with any of this stuff, doesn't matter, who cares? But if you are exploring how your diet affects your body, it doesn't matter eating more salt or less salt. The idea of lowering salt, salt's bad for you. Well, that's only if you actually have high blood pressure or risk of high blood pressure. Some people with low blood pressure have actually been told by their doctor to eat more salt because their risk is the complete opposite. Now there's less of them, but that's standard recommendation. It just has nothing to do with that person.
Well, a great one would be dairy, right?
Yeah.
Generally, right now, consensus is good for you. But if you have a dairy allergy and you listen to this, you're like, nope, that is not good for me, right? As an individual with a dairy allergy, I don't care how many papers and how much population data says dairy is the best thing in the world. Not happening, right? So
right. So so for diet, I mean, and that's pretty obvious when you eat something that your body disagrees with. Now you could be caught with a bit of a conflict, thinking you're being left out because, but I heard that's the thing I'm supposed to eat. Now I'm the loser who can't eat it. Like, am I just not gonna ever be as fit as the next person over, or is it gonna actually affect my health and longevity? It's like, no, not at all. It's everyone's body's gonna react to a certain set of foods differently than the next person over. And then you just got to solve which ones like fit best for you. And you probably, as you're listening, you could probably already think of a food that somebody can eat that you just can't handle. Hell, even people your genetic, like your family, somebody in your family can eat it. You just can't. You're just like, I can't do that. Like my mom and sister can eat spice way more than I can. We all grew up in the same house.
I'm very limited on guacamole.
Oh, there you go. Right?
I go over, it's devastating. Yeah.
The whole cilantro thing. Some people experience it as tasting like soap.
Right? But my mom hates cilantro, and I love it. Yeah.
But it's just an individual thing, and that's just how this is. So you got to figure that one out. So all of diet recommendations you got to take with a grain of salt. And they're going to be adjusted for whatever works in your body. Again, if you care and if you bother wanting to see how things go. Same with exercise. Two people following the exact same routine, like literally training together, are going to get different results. And it doesn't even necessarily mean they should be following the same routine, even if they have the same goal. For example, we were just in the gym, and Andre can do a military press that'll wreck his shoulder, but then he can do it on a machine, and it feels fine. So,
well, I was going to get to that. The tools in the gym, right? So you and I doing the same workout, and we're both doing bench press, and I get great results, you don't, but all you would have had to do is switch to dumbbells because that just suits you better, right? And so it's always remembering that populational data says that workouts are great for you, which is correct. But getting down to the workout at an individual level, you have to pick which tools you're going to use in the gym. The tools are the exercises, the frequency, the volume, the actual implements. All of that has to be personalized.
And so the general recommendation that might hold is exercise in general is likely going to move you to a healthier, fitter body than not. Okay, we can probably just agree across the board. But then from there, it gets individualized really quickly. Like, what if you have osteoarthritis in your knees and someone's like, well, you should run. You're like, well, I can't run. So does that mean I'm just never going to be fit? Like, no, you got to find a way around that. I had a buddy who had his elbow reconstruction. He has a titanium elbow. Like, certain exercises he could do before, you just can't do after. It doesn't mean he's done. He should never exercise, but it's got to be tailored to the
individualized.
Person. Right. So okay. So how are we going to wrap this one up here?
I think it's just reminding people, because it's very easy to kind of go down this rabbit hole and then just think that research is dumb, right? And it's I think of paramount importance just to remember that there are very specific, said that right, questions that research is trying to answer. And sometimes, especially right now where everything needs to be supported by 8 papers, we grab a paper and you find the results and they kind of line up with your bias and you're like, aha, look, like I told you. And you're not paying attention to what exactly is the question that paper was trying to answer. And then very specifically, most papers are varying degrees of population. Is, who was the population? Why was this being studied? And how does that actually apply to me or the people I'm talking to, writing to, etc. And for the individual, which is everyone listening or watching us now, it's that all of this is just to guide you. And your job, in the healthcare system, is to advocate for yourself as an individual. And then from a more health-based nutrition and exercise point of view, is that it guides you on what tools are available, and you do have to figure out what tools work for you. So for me, for the last 20 some odd years, like intermittent fasting just works really well for me. It fits. There are people out there who have bought Eat Stop Beat, done a 24-hour fast, and been like, nope, never again. Doesn't fit. Some people get great results on a front squat versus a back squat versus a machine squat. And then you're going to go online and you're going to see some girl who just got fantastic results from a back squat. And you're like, why am I doing machines? I should be doing that squat, even though you tried that squat already and it didn't really do much for you. And you just have to realize that these are all tools, implements that you have to sort of play with and find out the right tools for what you're trying to do. So you individualize everything.
Exactly. And I would also say, don't get discouraged if things that sound like they're what was supposed to be done, they're the healthy thing, and then you try it and it doesn't work or it's super difficult for you to do. And you're like, I just can't eat that food or eat in that pattern. Like, I just can't do it. It's highly likely you're not failing at all. It's just that was a general population level recommendation that was never really going to apply to you. And the onus is on you either to find people that can distill some of this information down. Either way, the onus is on you to interpret it and get it to the way it works for you. Doesn't matter if they say you should do this and that's healthy for everyone, and then it just doesn't work for you. That's not, again, to Brad's point, population data is never meant for one person. Even though we hear about it and we can be convinced that's how it's supposed to be for all of us, it really isn't. So
no. Not only that, but individual data is for that individual. So I wrote on Instagram about a time where I'd taken some time off from working out and then basically rededicated in 6 weeks, got to the state I was in that picture. And I was talking about how I did 2-a-day workouts. And, I left out the part that right through those doors there are a gym in my house. Super easy to do 2-a-day workouts when you have a gym in your house. Right. So really worked for me as an individual, but for the average person, it might have been disastrous. Right. Like they might work such a long shift every day at work that trying to get a workout in the morning and again at night just makes for such a long day that they're constantly exhausted and not recovering. Right. So anyone working a 12-hour shift, right, and I'm asking you to get a workout in the morning and at night, you're like, well, okay, now my day's like 16 hours before I get home. Like, so you really have to take this and individualize it. Same with your own health, right? The results you got obviously are not what most people are going to get, right? Like it's scary because hearing your story, I'd be curious how many people listening right now are actually a little bit nervous or a little bit scared about getting a scan because you got a scan and you ended up with lung cancer.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
yep.
It's obviously we're not saying any of this to scare anyone. It's just awareness. It's awareness that if you leave it up to what's the simple way to say this? If you leave all of your decisions up to how the medical system at its population-based level recommendations are going to guide you, as well as dietary interventions and its population-based information as it's going to guide you, and exercise at its population-based, like the minimum exercise, it's just so pathetically low. If you just followed all of that, I think you'd be quite disappointed with the results.
Well, yeah, a great way to look at it. If you just do what the medical system suggests you do, there's actually probably, based on your example, a 95% chance you'll be fine. But there's a 5% chance they're going to miss something drastic, right? And that's So you have to, you can't stress and angst over that 5%, but you have to be aware it's there. So sometimes it's worth considering that 5%.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. In most cases, it'll hold, but you aren't most cases. You're you, and you only got one body and one life. So if you feel like something's off, or you feel like the recommendations that you're hearing about diet or fitness or health, if you feel like they're not for you, or you're like, I don't, this doesn't seem right, like the way it didn't seem right to me. Yeah, that's fine. Then do something about it, because that's not a bad intuition to go with.
Yeah. Well, and then again, last point, just on, I'm gonna go specific to doctors, is to, like, it's very easy to rip on doctors and be like, they don't know, and of course they do. Like, I've yet to meet a doctor I didn't think was bright, but there's also been times where I've really, really been happy by getting a second opinion. Mm-hmm. And maybe the first doctor wasn't happy with me getting a second opinion, but it ended up helping a lot. So they are, generally speaking, as a population, not out to get you, not all pharma shills, et cetera. Most of them have sort of your best interest, but at the same time, it's good to get that second opinion, because there could be that 5% chance that it's lung cancer and not a mucus clot.
And right. And so, and to finish, so they're doing their best. They're not trying to make you worse. They're also not trying to lump undue stress onto you. Speaking of like healthcare practitioners and physicians in specifically, they're doing the best with what they can, but it really is on you to take all of that information, diet, fitness, healthcare directly in general. And when it feels like it's not working for you, then it makes sense to drill down, do a bit more work, and it's on you to personalize it for you.
Exactly. And that goes from medicine to health, fitness, to how exactly you want to do a leg press machine and where you want to put your feet, right? Mm-hmm. It comes all the way down to that. And then it's just the art of figuring out what works for you, and then the art of advocating for yourself.
Yep. All right. Yeah. I think that's a pretty good place to leave it for today.
Beauty. All right.
All right. So,
who brought this podcast, everybody?
Oh, yeah. Today we're brought to you by the Total T Clinic. Yep. Thanks for reminding me.
I'm on it.
All right. So for Brad Pilon, I'm John Barbin, and we'll talk to you next time.